We believe that any woman should have the right to ask for a termination of pregnancy within the first 3 months of pregnancy, because we believe that she alone should make the responsible decision whether she wants this pregnancy to continue or not.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of M.I.A.'s In-Depth Analyses, where I talk about Canadian politics and history. Today's episode is about the daddy, the king, the chief of abortion rights for women in Canada, Henry Morgentaler.
Henry reminds me of a barker at a sideshow. He just says, ladies, step right up, I've got the solution, guaranteed results, no complications, come up, ladies. And of course, you step into a barker's tent, you get ripped off. So you step into Henry's clinic, you get ripped off. He's just another barker at a sideshow. Step right up.
Henry Morgentaler spent most of his life advocating for women's reproductive rights and established illegal abortion clinics across Canada to meet the demand of women begging him for safe abortions.
He's willing to go to jail, perhaps for life.
He challenged federal and provincial governments to repeal their abortion laws, going to trial 3 times in the 1970s and finally winning his battle in 1988 with the Supreme Court of Canada.
Born in 1923 in Poland, the young Montreal doctor survived the Holocaust, spending time inside the concentration camps Auschwitz and Dachau. In other words, Henry Morgentaler was used to a fight.
Born on March 19, 1923 in Lodz, Poland, Morgentaler grew up in a socialist Jewish family during the 1920s and 1930s. Everybody knows what happened in 1939, and Poland was possibly the worst place to be as a Jew in Europe at that time. During the Second World War, the city of Lodz, Poland was briefly renamed Litzmannstadt after Karl Litzmann. The city's Jewish population was persecuted and forced into a ghetto. From there, they were rounded up and sent to German concentration camps across Germany and annexed countries of the Nazi regime. Henry Morgentaler was born to Jewish socialist parents who were killed in the Holocaust. Their names were Golda and Josef Morgentaler. Here is a photo of his 2 parents. His dad was the city councillor for the Bundist Party, a Jewish socialist party in Poland, promoting the political, cultural, and social autonomy of Jewish workers. It also sought to combat anti-Semitism and was generally opposed to Zionism. Henry's father, Josef, was murdered by the Gestapo while Henry was living with his mother and younger brother in the ghetto, with 164,000 others. When the Germans raided the ghetto to deport everyone to concentration camps, the Morgentalers, along with another family called the Rosenfarbs, and 2 other families, hid in a room with the door concealed behind a wardrobe. After 2 days of hiding, on August 27, 1942, Henry and his younger brother were sent to Dachau concentration camp, where they both remained until April 19th, 1945, when they were liberated by the U.S. Army.
I was in the ghetto first for 4 years in Lodz, in my native city in Poland, and then I was brought to Auschwitz and in Dachau. And I was liberated by the American forces in Dachau.
Can you imagine spending 3 years in a concentration camp? It's shocking that him and his younger brother both survived. They never saw their mother again. His mother was murdered at Auschwitz. When Henry was liberated in 1945, he weighed 71 pounds at the age of 22. So before we get into anything, this man is a fighter, and I have no doubt that his life in custody and on the run as a persecuted person affected the way he stood up for marginalized people for the rest of his life.
Well, I'm struck at the difference in our background. I mean, I spent the war as a kid in school, and you were in a concentration camp in Poland. Do you think that your concentration camp experiences helped in some way to prepare you for what you've been going through?
I didn't think it prepared me. I think what it did to me was that it sensitized me to human suffering and to injustice. And that these 2 elements were probably quite strong when I had to make my decision whether I, as a person, would be able to do something to relieve suffering and to remove some kind of injustice. And I think it did give me a great deal of satisfaction as well that I was able to do that. On the other hand, I would say that it probably made me more reluctant to practice this kind of civil disobedience, because I had lost 5 of my best years of life under terrible conditions. of denial of freedom, and daily danger of really being wiped out. And consequently, I did not cherish the idea of languishing in jail for many more years.
From there, he entered several displaced person camps before settling in Belgium, meeting his future wife. Before the war, in interviews, Henry has stated that he doesn't believe that his mother ever loved him or he felt replaced by his siblings, and that might have been a driving factor in why he spent most of his life trying to make women love him, essentially, in his own words. Henry Morgentaler survived Auschwitz and Dachau. Shava Rosenfarb, one of the family members of the Rosenfarb family that he hid with during the war, immigrated to Brussels in 1945. In 1946, Henry Morgentaler's younger brother emigrated to the United States, and Henry met up with Shava Rosenfarb in Brussels. They were there illegally, though, so him and his now fiancée were required to emigrate. During their time in Belgium, they were extremely poor, and because of the harsh economic conditions, no one was really doing that well during the post-war period. Here's a photo of Shava, her mother, and her sister Henia shortly after arrival in Belgium in late 1945 or early 1946. They are wearing coats made from UNRRA blankets. Henry Morgentaler and Shava Rosenfarb married in 1949 and left Europe in February 1950 on the RMS Samaria, sailing to Canada. They settled in Montreal, where Shava resumed her career as a writer. They had their first child, Goldie, in 1950, a second child, Abraham, a few years later. Henry Morgentaler completed his medical degree in 1953 at the Université de Montréal. He began a general practice in Montreal in 1955 once he was granted citizenship in Canada. Although he started as a general practitioner, he increasingly specialized in family planning, becoming one of the first Canadian doctors to perform vasectomies, insert IUDs, and provide birth control pills to unmarried women. On October 17, 1967, as president of the Humanist Fellowship of Montreal, he urged the Parliamentary Committee on Health and Welfare to repeal law against abortion.
Henry Morgentaler emerged as a public advocate for abortion in October of 1967 when he testified before a government committee.
He argued that women should have the right to safe abortion. After the media reports publicized his proposal, to his surprise, Morgentaler received thousands of calls from women desperate to arrange an abortion with him.
We don't feel like because you're pregnant, then you have to get married. You know, that's not how we're feeling at all. If we're getting married, it's not because of that. You know, I don't think it's a good beginning in a marriage.
Well, too many people make that mistake, I think. You know, my girlfriend's pregnant and I'm going to marry her, you know, because she's pregnant.
Any person who sincerely believes that abortion is murder need not have one. We're not suggesting that people who don't want abortion should have them any more than we're suggesting that people who don't want to drink should have it, or people who don't want to smoke cigarettes or die of cirrhosis or lung cancer should smoke cigarettes or drink martinis. What we are saying is the decriminalization of abortion is an absolute necessity, that all people in Parliament who do not support that position must be defeated. We are saying that all hospitals which receive government funds must be forced to readjust to give this simple medical procedure to all people who desire them. And you must get in the street, you must stay in the street, and if they tell you you're not ready, you just say, ready or not, here we come. Thank you very much.
His initial response was to refuse. Quote, "I hadn't expected the avalanche of requests and didn't realize the magnitude of the problem in immediate human terms. I answered, I sympathize with you. I know your problem, but the law won't let me help you. If I do help you, I'll go to jail. I'll lose my practice. I have a wife and 2 children. I'm sorry, but I just can't." End quote. However, his conscience got the better of him, and in 1969, he devoted his general practice to family planning. The main purpose of his clinic was now to perform illegal abortions to anyone that would come to him.
Do you remember the first abortion that you performed when you decided to essentially cross the Rubicon?
Well, it was an 18-year-old girl who was brought to me by her mother. Everything went well. We had a good result, and she was happy, the mother was happy, I was happy. So
He charged $200 per abortion, but he also took whatever the woman could get. If she had $10, if she had $50, if she had $75, he took whatever she could afford, because a lot of these women that needed help were marginalized women. The thing with abortion is when there's limited access, only rich people seem to have access to it. There was only one abortion clinic in the country, in Montreal, and thousands of American women and Canadian women were traveling across the country to get an abortion. What if you can't do that? If you're disabled, if you have prior commitments, if you're poor, there is no way you could get this kind of access. So the only people that suffer are those that are already on the bottom of society.
It seemed to me outrageous that in a so-called civilized society, women who have not committed any crime, all that they have done was engaging in normal sex. And once they found themselves pregnant, society would tell them, well, we're sorry, we can't help you. You've got to risk your life. You've got to risk your health. And there are no doctors, almost nobody who was willing to take a stand and help these women who could not obtain a safe legal abortion and who are desperate enough to do anything almost. And the fight is actually to ensure that women who need and want abortions will have access to medical doctors, not to quacks, and not to not be forced to the extremity of having to go to self-induced abortions with a terrible risk of injury and death as well. And I'm ready to go all the way to show to the people in Canada that the laws are unjust, that the application of the laws is unjust, that women are still suffering in Canada for no good reason at all. A woman who wants an abortion doesn't want to kill a baby. What she wants is to remove a few cells from the uterus before these cells will become a baby. And it is wrong to believe that an embryo is a fetus and a fetus is a baby, as it is wrong to assume that an acorn is already an oak and that an egg is a chicken already. And I give the comparison also to, for instance, a blueprint. A blueprint of a house is not a house yet. So the comparison between an embryo and a baby is absolutely non-scientific and absurd. And these people go out on the wrong premise, on the false premise that a fertilized egg is already a baby, so that consequently whoever interferes with that is killing babies, which is absolutely wrong.
Morgentaler said that he felt like a coward for years for sending the women away, as if he was shrinking from his responsibility. Eventually, in spite of the risk to himself, including loss of career, prison time, he decided to perform abortions for the health of women and, at the same time, challenge the law.
It is a cause which, in biblical terms almost, I saw as a fight between evil and good, between light and darkness. And maybe I'm a bit self-righteous, but I strongly believe in freedom of choice. I believe that women should have a right to own their bodies. I believe they should have a right to safe medical abortions when they need them. I think it's one of the great issues of our time.
He knew from newspaper reports and from recounts of women and other doctors that women in Montreal had died from incompletely performed abortions. He knew that women were determined to get these abortions in spite of the risk to their lives. Abortions are going to happen anyways, whether or not we have safe access to them. So why shouldn't women have the ability to go into a clinic and feel respected and cared for and be able to walk out of that without pain and with your dignity?
It was time for somebody, and that was me, to raise this issue so that women would be protected against all the hazards of bad abortion, self-induced abortion, injury as a result of that.
Morgentaler knew that he had it in his power to prevent unnecessary deaths of more women, so he decided to use civil disobedience to change the law. He has also said that his ego contributed to this. He loved being the center of attention because it must have meant he was doing something important and making a difference. In part because of his fight, on August 26, 1969, an amendment to the Criminal Code legalized abortion in Canada if, and only if, performed in a hospital setting and approved by a therapeutic abortion committee. committee, a group of mostly white men who meet without the woman. She never actually meets these people and discuss whether they believe that she has the right to have an abortion. Most of the time, they only approved cases in which the pregnancy would affect the health of the woman. There was, however, no requirement for a hospital to set up a committee, and only about 1/3 of hospitals did.
I have brought to the attention of provincial attorneys general my concern about the question of whether or not abortion committees are carrying out their responsibilities properly. As I see it, the law in 1969 gave those hospital committees the responsibility to be sure that abortions were only approved if the life or health of the mother was really in danger. And if that law doesn't work, if those committees won't carry out their responsibility, then it's back to me as a responsibility to see whether we can make any change.
But there are areas of Canada where abortion committees in hospitals just don't exist. What's to be done about this?
Well, that, of course, the criminal law is not designed to provide abortion committees, nor to force anybody to have abortion committees. It really was designed to allow those people who felt that in certain circumstances it was better to have an operation in order to save the mother's life than to go in the other direction. It was to allow them clearly to be able to do that we set up the procedure under the 1969 law. We weren't pro-abortion in doing that.
So even if you did want to get an abortion, you have to be deemed fit to have one. This left many areas without legal abortion, forcing women to travel and inducing barriers and delays, by which point it may be impossible to get an abortion.
It's very humiliating for a woman to have to be put through a committee decision from which there is no appeal. She doesn't even know who rules and on what basis they rule.
Sometimes committees never met. If they did, they never even saw the woman, and her fate was decided by subjective opinions. In addition, once the Therapeutic Abortion Committee's decision had been made, there were no appeals to that decision, so it couldn't be overturned, and that was the final say.
Once you understand how the system is set up, you can understand where the inequities are going to arise. First of all, you have to find a doctor. And if you live in a community where there may be only one or two doctors, neither of them are willing to consider your request, then you're going to have to go to another community and find other doctors. Maybe the doctor that you find feels that your request is valid, but he in turn can't convince the Therapeutic Abortion Committee in his hospital that your request is valid. So then a woman has to start all over again, find another doctor, another Therapeutic Abortion Committee, and on it goes. There can be, depending on where you live, a great deal of shopping around before you can arrive at therapeutic abortion.
Let's work out, though, in the kind of person who gets an abortion. For instance, how about a truck driver's wife as opposed to a university professor's wife or mistress?
Well, we've always recognized that there are gross socio-economic inequalities in this area. The more well-to-do have always been able to get abortions done safely and effectively. The lower classes, lower middle classes, you would find perhaps very real difficulties in trying to find someone sympathetic to your cause who would arrange it.
The thing that disturbs me more is the apparent large number of abortions in 3 or 4 provinces, and particularly it happens the more wealthy provinces. And that disturbs me about our legal processes. I don't think that's very convincing. It looks almost as though being affluent accompanies desire then to stay affluent by not having the additional child. And that certainly, in my mind, is no grounds for having an abortion, and therefore a grounds for us reviewing the law.
There's another way to interpret those figures. Many insist that outside the affluent urban areas, there are just no hospital committees, that it's impossible for a woman to obtain a therapeutic abortion in her area. The Montreal General Hospital, for example, is one of only a few hospitals in Quebec with a committee. It handles 100 operations a month.
Well, first of all, the law says that a woman can have a pregnancy terminated if the doctor and the Therapeutic Abortion Committee consider that the continuation of her pregnancy would endanger her health. When you look at this phrase, endangers health, critically you'll realize that it's almost impossible to define it logically and consistently. Then there's a problem in the Therapeutic Abortion Committee. It's not defined, as it's defined by the law, it consists of 3 doctors who don't have any direct contact with the patient. But the law doesn't require that a hospital set up a Therapeutic Abortion Committee. So many hospitals or departments evade the whole issue of abortion simply by not setting up a Therapeutic Abortion Committee. So if a doctor wants the case considered and there's no therapeutic abortion committee, he can't do anything but tell his patient that she's simply going to have to go somewhere else, to another hospital, where they may or may not have a therapeutic abortion committee. So this is restrictive and discriminatory, and it victimizes doctors and patients alike.
Morgentaler was doing abortions in private clinics, which was still very much illegal. As of 1969, abortions had to be done in a hospital setting. So Morgentaler continued to do his abortions, and he also didn't submit the abortions to the Therapeutic Abortion Committee for approval. In 1969, when Morgentaler opened an abortion clinic in Montreal, he applied for status as a model abortion clinic and proposed to the federal and provincial governments that abortions could be done safely outside of hospitals and in a private clinic setting. Every time he applied for this status, he was ignored by the provincial and federal governments. Instead, they sent the police.
It is the 1st of June, 1970. They are here for a routine raid on the clinic of an abortionist.
On June 1st, 1970, Montreal City Police raided Morgentaler's clinic and laid several charges of performing illegal abortions. Because his lawyer thought that stalling would be the best choice, as he thought that over time public opinion would start to shift on abortion, the first case did not come to trial until 1973. To draw attention to the safety and efficacy of clinical abortions, in a king-shit move, Morgentaler published the fact that he had successfully carried out over 5,000 abortions in 1973.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I wish to share a secret with you tonight that in the last 5 years, from 1968, I have performed 5,000 abortions in my clinic in Montreal in defiance of the abortion law, which I consider to be unjust, unfair, restrictive.
In the meantime, women's groups organized in support of Morgentaler, and he continued to perform abortions. Between 1973 and 1976, Morgentaler was tried 3 times in Montreal for defying the abortion law, and each time he was acquitted by a jury, by raising the defense of necessity.
I was convinced in my mind that if I came before a jury and I explained my motivations, that I would be acquitted, and this is exactly what happened.
Each time, the jury took less time to reach their decision. At the 3rd trial, they took just 1 hour to acquit him. This is called jury nullification, the refusal of juries to enforce a law that they perceived to be unjust. At the 1973 trial, Morgentaler was defended by Claude Armand Chapard, who presented the defense of necessity. As a doctor, Morgentaler had a duty to safeguard the life and health of the women who came to him for abortions, which outweighed his duty to obey the law.
I just wanted the jury to never lose sight of this doctor, that he was there and that he was very important. They had no idea why I thought he was important.
Voici la machine. Dr. Desrosiers is called to the stand. He is indeed a highly regarded Montreal gynecologist who has been advising the Crown since before the raid. Today he has been called to demonstrate Morgentaler's vacuum aspirator.
What was devastating about his evidence, that he had referred himself patients to Dr. Morgentaler, including his secretary, and had even sent a letter of congratulations to Dr. Morgentaler.
And
if you put a situation like that in the script, people would say you're exaggerating, but it actually happened.
And yet Desrosiers was like a lot of other people who take a strong moral stand against abortion. When it came down to one of his patients or his own secretary faced with an unwanted pregnancy, he sent her to Morgentaler's clinic.
After hearing some of the women as witnesses, the jury acquitted him. A jury found him not guilty of violating Section 251 of the Criminal Code.
Est-ce que vous avez un verdict?
Oui.
Quel est votre verdict?
Non coupable.
In 1974, the province of Quebec appealed the acquittal. The jury's acquittal was overturned by 5 judges on the Quebec Court of Appeal in 1974, who substituted a conviction. Morgentaler appealed his conviction to the Supreme Court of Canada, but the court upheld his conviction in a 6-3 decision, stating that the danger to the women was not immediate.
Yes, I'm very confident. I hope that eventually now the time will come that the women in Canada and I personally will receive justice.
The judges conclude that the law may be foolish, it may be narrow, but only Parliament has the power to change it. By a margin of 6-3, the Supreme Court rejects Morgentaler's appeal. Morgentaler is taken by surprise, and for once he has nothing to say. He is simply stunned.
He was sentenced to 18 months in prison and began serving his sentence in March of 1975.
Morgentaler's second trial begins late in May of 1975. Though he's been in and out of the Palais de Justice at least 100 times over the last 5 years, this time he gets to come in through the special entrance, the one reserved for defendants who are already behind bars.
Shepard advised me to plead guilty. He said, look, Henry, you're convicted already. It cost you more money. You don't have money. They got you by the balls. I think I can arrange that you get a concurrent sentence, which means you won't get more than the 18 months that you got. I said, never will I plead guilty. Never, 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 never. I haven't committed any crime. You're going to see you're going to win.
Morgentaler is right.
Non coupable.
Though the judge virtually orders them to convict, it takes the jury less than an hour this time to find him not guilty. As one of the jurors tells a reporter, the judge is not the Pope, you know. Immediately after the trial, Morgentaler is taken back to prison to finish serving his sentence. A few days later, Mike brings his brother the news that Choquette has ordered a third trial. On the outside, however, the news of a third trial arouses a storm of protest. The case is finally raised in Parliament by no less than John Diefenbaker, who, like others, wants an explanation of how a man can be acquitted twice and still end up in prison.
In 1975, under Liberal Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian Parliament changed the law so that an appeals court could not overturn a jury acquittal, although they could order a new trial.
In Parliament, the debate over his treatment continues until a new federal justice minister, Ron Basford, responds with a piece of legislation to ensure that never again will a higher court overrule a jury acquittal and substitute its own guilty verdict.
However, Morgentaler was already in jail.
In his honor, it will be called the Morgentaler Amendment, but it will come too late to do Dr. Henry Morgentaler any good.
By the way, this was the first time that an appeal court had overturned a jury acquittal in Canadian history without any trial. They just overturned it and sent him to prison, which is crazy to me. In total, Morgentaler served 10 months in prison. He suffered a heart attack while in solitary confinement, after which he was released to a hospital.
One night, Morgentaler stubbornly refuses a guard's order and is thrown into the hole.
I want you to draw me like one of your French girls.
Left alone in the hole, Morgentaler suffers a mild heart attack. And when a guard finally notices, the doctor is rushed by ambulance to a nearby hospital.
Well, at a moment when you were in Bordeaux jail and you had that heart attack, we really, some of us thought, well, maybe he'll die there. I mean, we really did think that. Did you feel at the moment, at that time, that you might die?
Yes, when I was thrown into solitary confinement, I had moments of panic when I thought that I would die.
Can you compare it with the time that you were in concentration camp?
Well, yeah, compared to a concentration camp, this was a sanatorium, but compared to ordinary conditions and to even normal jails, it's a hellhole.
I had known worse. I had been to a concentration camp, and compared to a concentration camp, prison is not that bad.
In January 1976, a third trial was begun against Morgentaler on the first set of charges. On the 18th of September 1976, the trial ended in an acquittal by a different jury.
2 months later, he is back in the Palais de Justice. Basford has offered a new trial to give Morgentaler a chance to clear his name, and Morgentaler accepts. The trial begins on April the 12th and ends as expected.
Non coupable, votre honneur.
This was his third jury acquittal in Quebec.
24 hours for the first jury, 6 hours for the second, barely 1 hour for the last.
After a third jury trial led to another acquittal, all further charges were dropped. In 1976, the Parti Québécois took over. They realized that the abortion law could not be enforced if juries would not convict, so they dropped the remaining charges.
One of its first moves after becoming the government of Quebec, the Parti Québécois dropped all charges against him. A victory for Morgentaler.
On December 11, 1976, the new Justice Minister, Marc-André Bedard, dropped the charges against Morgentaler and other doctors and announced that there would be no further trials for clinic abortions in Quebec.
The new Minister of Justice, Marc-André Bedard, writes the federal government to say that the abortion law can no longer be enforced in the province of Quebec. Bedard's letter to Ottawa is never answered.
Je n'ai jamais reçu de réponse à cette lettre que j'ai envoyée aux autorités fédérales.
This was just in time to prevent a fourth trial for Morgentaler starting the following Monday. In 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted as part of the Canadian Constitution. The charter was relevant to Morgentaler's later court cases.
In 1983, 13 years after the first raid, he takes up the crusade once again, opening abortion clinics in Ontario and Manitoba.
In 1983, Morgentaler began expanding on his abortion clinics by establishing clinics in Winnipeg and Toronto, which were still illegal in these provinces.
The federal government did not take up the challenge. It preferred to let Quebec refuse to enforce the law and look the other way.
Police raided both clinics shortly after they opened.
At the present time, can you sense in any way that the police are out to get you?
Not the police by themselves. I think they have orders from higher up. That is quite obvious. Not the police themselves. Many policemen had their wives and daughters in my clinic, and even at times when I had been arrested or in the middle of judicial proceedings, they knew that I would treat their wives and daughters just as I treat anybody else.
Encouraged by public support for his struggle and concerned about women's access to abortion in other provinces and his worry that women in poverty couldn't afford to travel to Quebec to get safe abortions, Morgentaler decided to challenge the law in other provinces.
In the 1980s, he took his fight to the rest of Canada, mostly Ontario.
He spent the next 15 years throughout the 80s and 90s opening and running abortion clinics across Canada in a clear violation of the law. In each province, he announced in advance that he would be opening a clinic.
In each province, the Attorney General warns that the government will have no choice but to respond.
By this point, the tide of public opinion had turned in Morgentaler's favor. A Gallup poll in 1983 showed that 72% of Canadians believed that the decision to abort should rest solely with a pregnant woman and her doctor. In 1983, Toronto police raided Morgentaler's newly opened clinic, and he and his two colleagues were charged with providing illegal miscarriages. Once again, Morgentaler used the defense of necessity and was acquitted by the jury. The Attorney General's office appealed the acquittal, and the verdict was reversed by the Court of Appeal for Ontario, which directed a new trial. Once again, an appeal court had overturned a jury acquittal. Once again, Morgentaler appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. This time, Morgentaler challenged the law as unconstitutional on the grounds that it denied women the right to life, liberty, and security of the person.
Today, the highest court in the land granted him victory and struck down the existing abortion law.
In 1988, heard by the Supreme Court of Canada, it was a victory for Morgentaler. The court upheld the original jury acquittal. In addition, it declared that the 1969 abortion law violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and thus was unconstitutional in the case of R.V. Morgentaler, 1988.
Tell me, what was that day like when the Supreme Court made their decision declaring the current law unconstitutional, the then law? What was that day like?
Well, it was hectic. It was very gratifying for me. First of all, to hear it, I was at the Supreme Court in Ottawa. To hear that decision, it was really, I was flabbergasted, and if I can say that. It was like a complete victory. And
the law was found to violate Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms because it infringes on a woman's right to life, liberty, and security of the person. After 1988, as a result, Canada had no law concerning abortion. The procedure, therefore, was governed not by federal law but by provincial and medical regulations. This meant that even though abortion had been decriminalized, it was not equally available still. More than 20 years later, abortion services are still particularly difficult to access in rural locations, the far north, and in the Maritimes. For example, abortions are not performed in Prince Edward Island to this day, and it's very hard to get one in New Brunswick. Morgentaler described this as the happiest day of his life. In 1989, Nova Scotia took just one day to pass a law that banned abortions, making all clinic abortions illegal, or at least unfunded. Morgentaler opened a clinic in Nova Scotia and announced that he had performed abortions there. The government laid charge of violating the Nova Scotia Medical Services Act of 1989, and Nova Scotia then sought an injunction to stop Morgentaler from performing clinical abortions. The injunction was granted on the ground that there was an overwhelming need to ensure that provincial laws were respected. It rejected the argument that the Supreme Court's 1988 decision in R.V. Morgentaler prohibited provinces from passing laws that simply made clinical abortions illegal. To fight the charges and injunction, Morgentaler challenged the constitutionality of the Nova Scotia Medical Services Act. In 1993, the case came before the Supreme Court of Canada, and the province argued that it was combating the privatization of health services. The court, however, unanimously struck down that part of the act that forbade procedures in clinics. R.V. Morgentaler, 1993. In June 1991, the Ontario government announced that all abortions in the province would be covered by OHIP, the Ontario Health Insurance Plan, so women would no longer have to pay out of pocket for abortions, as they did in other provinces. In 1994, New Brunswick banned abortions in clinics outside of hospitals. Look, we're right back to 1967. In 1995, provincial and federal rulings forced Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to allow private abortion clinics. And in 1996, Alberta gave in to financial pressure and finally agreed to fund clinics. Quote from Morgentaler, quote, "Have all these people forgotten that women used to die in our countries from self-induced or quack abortions, that unwanted children were given away to institutions where they suffered enormous trauma that took the joy of life away from them and made them into anxious, depressed individuals with a grudge against society? Have all these people forgotten that an unwanted pregnancy was the biggest health hazard to young, fertile women and could result in a loss of fertility, long-term illness, injury, and death?" End quote. While no precise figures exist, it is estimated that between 4,000 and 6,000 women in Canada died from illegal abortions from 1926 to 1947. In 1990, the Progressive Conservatives of Canada, which is totally an oxymoron, attempted to recriminalize abortion. Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney introduced Bill C-43, which would punish doctors with prison time if they performed abortions for women whose health was not at risk. It passed in the House of Commons by a close vote of 140 to 131. It was not yet in law, but within a week, a 20-year-old university student bled to death in a university residence from a self-induced coat hanger abortion, and a teenage girl was injured in a back alley botched abortion.
Already we have a case of a woman who used a detergent, Drano, to abort herself, to induce abortion.
The casualties of unwanted pregnancy were quickly publicized, and abortion rights demonstrations were held after the death of the student, protesting Bill C-43, and the bill was defeated in the Senate by a tie vote in early 1991, and the casualties of abortions ceased. Wow, it's almost like if you provide healthcare to people, less people die. In 2008, the challenge was before the courts. The province originally stated that women could get medically necessary abortions at New Brunswick hospitals. In 2006, however, the last hospital in New Brunswick to perform publicly funded abortions, the Dr. Everett Commerce Hospital in Fredericton, announced that it would suspend abortion services as of July 1st. New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island are the only provinces in Canada that refuse to pay for abortions in clinics, and this rule violates the Canadian Health Act as well as the 1988 Supreme Court Morgentaler decision. The province argued that Morgentaler could not have standing because only a woman who needed to use the clinic had the right to challenge abortion policy. The New Brunswick Court of Queen's bench ruled that Morgentaler had standing to proceed with a lawsuit against the government. Could you not? I'm filming here. You're being rude. That leaves the Morgentaler Clinic in Fredericton, where women can obtain abortions by paying up to $750. Again, we're back to only women with financial means being able to get abortions, which is so fucked up.
And even today, access to abortion is far from guaranteed. The procedure is still not available in every province, and it remains expensive. Women in rural and northern communities have to travel hundreds of miles or more in order to obtain the procedure. For Morgentaler, the fight goes on.
In 2009, Morgentaler was working to open 2 private clinics in the Canadian Arctic so that women who live there don't have to travel vast distances to obtain abortions.
I think the abortion debate is practically over.
But whenever there's a Supreme Court judge in the United States, this comes up. Whenever they talk about it, they still talked about it with regards to the Conservative government when they took power in Canada. What would they do? I mean, that was often just the Liberal Party scaring people, thinking that they would do this again. But it's still there. Abortion is still, it's not a slam dunk for a lot of people.
Well, it's probably not going to be resolved in the minds of people as long as the Catholic Church and many other churches are adamantly opposed to it.
God's not real.
Many instances of anti-abortion violence occurred against Morgentaler, his staff, his patients, and his colleagues. Without abortion services, women literally die. It's been shown time and time again. So let's not be pro-life here. Let's call it what it is. The CCPs, Crusaders for Compulsory Pregnancy, or as Morgentaler likes to say, fetus fetishist.
Now, they're a group in Canada called the pro-lifers.
By the way, we don't call them pro-lifers. We call them CCPs.
Oh, baby, how was I supposed to know?
And that stands for Crusaders for Compulsory Pregnancy. Or else we call them fetus fetishists, because that's a very good description of what they're standing for.
I certainly don't think this Parliament would support any widening of the abortion laws. I think it would be more likely willing to support a tightening.
Well, the criminal code says that to set up a therapeutic abortion committee is merely a permissive, not mandatory.
Is your name even Anna? No? Or is it something terrible like Gwendolyn?
And the idea was that according to the area, if they felt there was so-called need, it would be they would then be permitted to do so. But abortion is not a right.
These people really believe this. These people really believe this, and that's really wild to me.
It's not a right at all. It's something that is permitted under certain circumstances when there's a threat to the mother's life or health.
We are actually the people who are pro-life. We are for the right of women and couples to determine what their life is going to be like, whether they're going to have children or not, how many children they're going to have, whether they should use birth control methods or not.
Anti-abortion violence is described by CSIS as terrorism. Death threats against Morgentaler were frequent.
Have you had any threats on your life, or the life of your children or your wife?
Well, I've had a few, but I don't take them too seriously. I think these are people usually who are, cowards who use the telephone anonymously just to get a message across to bother you, and I really haven't taken them seriously.
In the 1980s, a reporter said that the stack of death threats for a single month was 6 inches thick.
Were you prepared to be killed for this cause?
Yeah, well, I was prepared, but I hoped it wouldn't happen. But I was prepared. I knew I was in a kind of dangerous profession. I knew that doctors were being shot. I knew that I was a target, and I was determined to be able to continue in spite of all that.
In 1983, a man attacked Morgentaler with garden shears outside of his Toronto abortion clinic. Augusto Dantas was charged with assault and with possession of a weapon dangerous to the public good. On July 29, 1983, protesters attempted to firebomb his clinic, but the clinic only suffered minor damage. The neighboring Toronto women's bookstore was nearly destroyed. In May 1992, the Morgentaler Clinic on Harvard Street in Toronto was firebombed during the night by 2 people using gasoline as fuel in a firework to set off the explosion. I love that the pro-life loves to firebomb places. They just get a hard-on for burning the shit out of abortion clinics, which is just so ironic. The next day, the clinic management announced that the firebombing failed to prevent any abortions.
Oh no. Oh no.
Since all scheduled abortions were carried out in alternative locations. We love that for them. Love when terrorist activity doesn't work out.
An early morning fire at the Morgentaler abortion clinic was the work of an arsonist. Police from 14 divisions say some kind of incendiary similar to a Molotov cocktail was thrown against the front door of the clinic around 2 a.m. The fire was quickly extinguished, damage was confined to the exterior, and the clinic is open for business.
Because of the arson, the Ontario government spent $420,000 on improved security for abortion clinics. At the time, Canada didn't collect stats on harassment or violence against abortion providers, clinics, or patients. There were also fucking sniper attacks on doctors such as Garson Romalis and Hugh Short. Morgentaler stated that he was ready to die for the cause, and I think a lot of abortion doctors were terrified at the time of actually being murdered. Dr. Barnett Slepian was murdered in Buffalo on October 23rd, 1998 by a high-powered rifle. Let's say it together, kids. There's no hate like Christian love. Abortion doctors started wearing bulletproof vests and pulled their curtains to prevent assassins from shooting into their homes. Morgentaler was quoted as saying, "I know of anecdotal evidence that some doctors are considering that they might not be able to continue. It's a very bad situation." Garson Romalis was stabbed in 2000. Morgentaler Morgentaler said that some doctors in Ontario, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland had stopped doing abortions. Quote, "For years, we have been living in the shadow of the doctors being killed. This violence is a sign of frustration, rage, and moral bankruptcy in the anti-abortion movement." End quote. I got this fuzzy thing, so I just whipped off that sock I had on there, and let's see how it goes. It's fuzzy. On July 1st, 2008, Canada Day, he was named a member of the Order of Canada for his commitment to increased health care options for women, his determined efforts to influence Canadian public policy, and his leadership in humanist and civil liberty organizations. Henry Morgentaler died in Toronto of heart failure on the 29th of May, 2013, at the age of 90.
I've done things that my father would have approved of, that my mother would have approved of, and I was sort of having a dialogue with my father and mother. I said, well, you can be proud of me. A willingness to deny the evil of the concentration camps, to erase the evil that can be done by people to people, to fight against the inhumanity of man to man. And I see it in those terms.
All right, guys, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you catch the next one because I'm wearing blue. I'm almost at the end of the rainbow, so what the am I going to do next? What the fuck am I going to do next? Hey. Ugh. Can she, if I don't pay attention to her, she'll start eating my plants because she knows that I hate it. Take care of yourselves. Tip your server, tip your bartender, tell your mom that you love her. Make sure to like and subscribe. I'll be posting another video next Tuesday. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. And see you in the next one.
A determined individual, ready to make the sacrifices and risk his freedom, can set the system on its ears.